Hey, Dr. Segrin here, and we're going to have another video lecture today. I'll try to keep it as short as possible for you. But today we're going to be learning about more biogeochemical cycles like we have been learning about. But instead of calcium this time, we're going to talk about some other really important elements in the world, carbon and nitrogen. And just like calcium, carbon and nitrogen move throughout the world. Atoms of these elements shift between life forms and rocks and the water and the air, and that's why we call them biogeochemical cycles, is because they're moving between bio, life, geo, the earth, they're chemicals, and they're moving around in like a circle, cycling around through the earth. I usually also briefly mention water, the water cycle, but for the most part, I think we're familiar with that for a long time. If you're not, as a reminder, water is hydrogen and oxygen, and it mainly moves through the world through physical changes, not so much chemical changes. And those physical changes are evaporation. I'm sure we learned that in kindergarten or whatever elementary school. Evaporation is when water heats up and turns into a vapor. Condensation is when it condenses and cools into things like clouds and in the real world. And then precipitation is when it falls back down to the earth. So I'm not going to give you any more detail than that on the water cycle. So before we begin on the carbon and nitrogen cycle, I like to start with a question. That's a bit of a head scratcher. And that question is, when a baby is born, does the world get heavier? When a baby is born, does the world get heavier? And usually I toss this question around the room and kind of discuss it. And there's a variety of answers. And some people say, of course, it has to get heavier. I mean, the baby weighs something, right? So others go, I'm not so sure, that seems odd. The answer is the world does not get heavier when a baby is born or when a baby grows or any of that stuff. And the reason for that, if we think about planet Earth, the only way planet Earth could get heavier or lighter is if matter, atoms, came in from outer space and landed on Earth, or somehow matter left Earth. So technically Earth gets a little bit lighter in the sense of less massive, having less mass. If like a rocket ship leaves with some astronauts, yeah, Earth gets a little bit lighter. If a meteor hits Earth, maybe it would get slightly heavier, the weight of the meteor, the mass of that meteor, we had some more atoms. But barring any of that, Earth's overall mass stays the same, doesn't change. That's actually kind of a deep thought with biogeochemical cycles. If Earth's mass stays the same, that means pretty much all the atoms that were here when Earth first formed are the same atoms that are here today. And all of these atoms are just moving around, doing different things, becoming different things, breaking down, chemically reacting, shifting around. Just like we learned about with calcium, at some point in Earth's history, it was a seashell, and then that little atom of calcium, when that snail or clam died, sank to the bottom of the ocean and became a rock. And then later on, millions of years later, that rock was on the land, getting hit by acid rain and dissolving that calcium atom, and then that calcium atom makes a journey back to the ocean, and so on and so forth. Well, getting back to our baby question, you are made up of the same atoms that are moving around, making up everything else. And actually, one way to think about your own body is that you are made up of kind of recycled materials. Every atom in your body used to be something else, and that's really what we're going to be getting into today. Where did all these atoms come from? How do they get into your body? And where are they going when they leave your body? And we'll come back to this point at the end of our lecture today. So let's start with carbon, and then we'll move on to nitrogen. So yes, we say that a lot of atoms in your body are made of carbon, and carbon is really, really important in the world for rocks and for life and for water and for the air. Carbon is everywhere. And yes, every carbon atom in your body, as you were growing and accumulating more and more atoms, actually came from your food. And so that expression, you are what you eat, is actually true. And we'll talk about that momentarily. So before we talk about you and other animals on our planet, we'll first start with photosynthesis. And how this lecture is going to work is we are going to think about the carbon that's moving around in the world, but at various kind of stages and certain processes we're going to highlight, and then we're going to put the whole thing together at the end. And because it's a cycle, it doesn't really matter where you start, but we're just going to go ahead and start with photosynthesis. And I think this is probably something that everybody is familiar with from biology at some point or another in their life. Photosynthesis is how plants make food. And the food they're making is actually sugar. And they're making that sugar from sunlight and carbon dioxide and water. And here's our chemical reaction for that. So if you take sunlight, the energy from sunlight, you combine that with carbon dioxide, CO2, and H2O, which is water. And then we have this arrow that's saying that this stuff is all combining to make sugar, which happens to be C6H12O6 for the most basic molecule of sugar called glucose. And a byproduct of this reaction is oxygen. And so that partially explains why plants breathe out oxygen. So in the process of photosynthesis, if we are just concerned about tracking the carbon atoms move from the molecule of carbon dioxide, which is in the atmosphere, or the air, and they're moving to form this bigger molecule of sugar, which is in living organisms. So most carbon that is in the living world in biological organisms is in the form of sugar, and of course then sugar can get modified into all kinds of other things. For example, your liver can make sugar into fat if you eat a lot of sugar, or if you're just eating a lot of things, period. And so some of those carbon atoms would then turn into fat. But it's all basically carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Another big process for the carbon cycle, for how carbon is moving around in the world, is something called cellular respiration. And pretty much everything on planet Earth does this in some fashion or another. So even plants do this as well. We'll come back to that in a second. But basically in the process of cellular respiration, sugar is broken down back into carbon dioxide and water. And if we look at this chemical reaction at the bottom, it is exactly the opposite of photosynthesis. We take our big molecule of sugar on the left, that's the C6H12O6 molecule. We need oxygen for this reaction, so we combine these two things, and the products, the arrow points to carbon dioxide and water, and it also releases energy. And this could be a good time to pause and talk about sugar for a second with a couple of lab demos.
Alright, so I'm outside today because the chemical reaction I'm going to show you is a little bit dangerous to do in a room, and apparently you need a lot of ventilation for it. I've never actually done it before. What I'm actually going to show you is that carbon is an element in sugar. Normally when you think carbon, you think things like, I don't know, pure carbon, stuff like charcoal and coal, graphite for your pencil, this kind of black or gray substance. That's what carbon is. When you look at sugar, it hardly looks like that at all. And that's because sugar is a molecule with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the chemical reaction I'm going to show you is using sulfuric acid. You can pull off all the hydrogen and oxygens in sugar and leave only the carbon behind. And process kind of proving that carbon is in fact in sugar. Well, this is pretty simple in terms of in directions. Basically, I'm going to put sugar in this beaker, I'm going to add some sulfuric acid, and then we're just going to watch what happens. And this is also going to be another time-lapse recording. All right, as we can see, this sugar, what started as sugar, once you take away all the hydrogen and oxygen from that molecule and leave only the carbon, it begins looking more and more like carbon. And the reason it's growing is because various gases are being produced that are kind of puffing it up over time. But that's what carbon looks like, and that came from sugar. It's still growing. And yeah, it's completely hard. I should say it's completely, it's kind of crusty feeling. Well, there you have it. Definitely there's carbon in sugar. And by the way, this has gotten very, very hot. And so the process of ripping all those hydrogen and oxygen atoms off has released a good amount of energy. So not only is sugar made of carbon, but once you break it apart, you release energy. Pretty freaking cool. I like it.
Well, that was pretty interesting. Let's get back to our lecture. All right, another huge part of where carbon is in the world is something called fossil fuels. And normally in a normal year, non-virtual year, we would have some do-nows and things like that where we talk about fossil fuels, but this is our first introduction to fossil fuels. I think I briefly mentioned them when talking about the Industrial Revolution, the human history lecture, where I was talking about how humans have changed over time and how in the last 200 or 300 years we've started burning this stuff called fossil fuel, and that it's adding a lot of problems to the world. So we will add on to that today a little bit. But fossil fuels are these things deposited underground, and they're made of old dead stuff. These are things like coal, oil, and gas. And what I mean by old dead stuff is like in swampy environments, for example, when trees die and fall into the mud and kind of sink down in the mud and decompose partially and get pushed down deep into the earth, that process is what forms coal in the world. And so when we're talking about coal, not charcoal that you burn on your grill, but coal, the coal that you dig out of the ground in a mine, that is made of old dead trees, basically. And the same for oil and gas, made from old dead other stuff. We'll talk more about them later in the year. And the chemical reaction that typically happens with fossil fuels is combustion. And that simply means burning something. So the carbon that is locked up in coal or oil or gas underground is dug up, and then we light it on fire. It needs oxygen to burn. That's like anybody who works on a car. Obviously, you have air intake system in your car. That's because to burn things like gasoline, you need oxygen. Your car needs to take in oxygen. And the process, it makes an exhaust, carbon dioxide, water, and it releases energy. And you might be noticing that this bottom reaction, with the exception of this molecule here, which I've labeled CXHX, the X stands for, it can be a variety of numbers. Sometimes there's also oxygen and other things in these fuels, but the typical formula is carbon and hydrogen in some varying amounts. You'll notice that this reaction where you're taking some kind of carbon and hydrogen and you're mixing it with oxygen to make carbon dioxide and water and energy is, well, pretty much the exact same as cellular respiration, except it's not sugar, it's some other carbon and hydrogen molecule, but very similar process.
I forgot to record one of my demos at school, but this is not such a bad thing because we can check in on my dogs here at home. But what I wanted to show you is sugar and cellular respiration. We say that we burn sugar for energy of our cells. And you might be thinking burning sugar, and it's a similar reaction to a combustion reaction for other fuels. So if you burn gasoline, that's like burning sugar. So I wanted to visualize that for you. Unfortunately, you can't typically burn like table sugar under normal conditions because it's a solid, and remember, part of the combustion reaction, everybody mowing their lawn at one, part of the combustion reaction is oxygen, and if you have something that's a really dense solid, oxygen can't really mix in to react well with it. But if you have sugar where a lot of oxygen is already mixed in, that will burn quite well, which is our good friend marshmallows will provide that for us. Marshmallows are basically just sugar. The main ingredients are corn syrup, which is sugar, and sugar, but it's been puffed up full of air. And because it's puffed up full of air, when you actually ignite it, the sugar and air, the oxygen in the air, can actually create a combustion reaction. So let's take a look. All right, you're gonna have to bear with the noise here as I talk. But anybody who's ever roasted marshmallows or made s'mores over a campfire know that, yes, marshmallows are very combustible. And again, it only works because there's a nice mixture of air in here. Well, you can definitely, it smells very nice. You can definitely see it's burning. It's not completely igniting like I would like it to. We might need a bit of a stronger fire than this, because this wind, let's see if I can get it. Hey, that's burning now. So it's a self-sustaining reaction for the most part, as long as it has enough oxygen. And still burning. And looks like the outer surface is kind of totally charred. And probably what happened is the this side of the marshmallow didn't have any oxygen getting to it, and it couldn't quite sustain a reaction. It was only the outer surface. If you had a bigger fire, it probably would go better. But that's the idea. Clearly, there's a lot of energy in sugar. And we can take this one step further. You know, if we're talking about paper, that's made from plant materials and wood. And wood itself, obviously, is made by plants. They're making wood out of the results of photosynthesis. So basically, wood is mainly what we would call cellulose, which is a type of sugar of sorts. And obviously we know that that burns. And if I have a bigger fire going and I add these marshmallows, you'll definitely see they'll burn completely just like the wood. So let's light this on fire. Clearly paper will burn. Alright, so this is what we're left with of our fire. And you can tell, compared to all the wood and leaves and grass and marshmallows that I put in here, there's not much left, and what's left is pretty powdery. Clearly no sugar left here. Kind of smells nice. It smells like burnt sugar a little bit. And so all of that mass, again, remember the conservation of mass, we didn't destroy anything. It's all still here with us on Earth, but instead of being in wood and leaves and grass and marshmallows, it's all in the air now. That's combustion. And that's pretty much the same reaction that's happening in every single one of your cells right now, but in a more controlled way. And instead of releasing the energy as fire, it's releasing the energy in a way that it can be captured to move your blood and move your muscles and create new skin and new cells and all that stuff. But that is the basics of what's going on. So there you go. That definitely pretty conclusively shows that sugar will burn just like any other fuel, whether it be gasoline or alcohol or wood, leaves. It's all the same, basically. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. That's what it is.
And both cellular respiration and combustion of fossil fuels will take the carbon that's in the life form or in the old dead life form and will release it into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So all of that carbon, all of those carbon atoms are moving from either deep in the earth and getting burned up and put into the atmosphere. Oh man, it wouldn't be a biogeochemical cycle lecture if I didn't mention my good buddy, limestone, calcium carbonate. Yeah, at this point, my favorite rock, I think. So one thing you might notice is that it's called calcium carbonate. So there's clearly must be carbon in this molecule that makes limestone and seashells and all kinds of other stuff. And yes, shellfish, among other things, can pull carbon out of the water to make their shells with this following reaction here. And so the carbon is being pulled from the water and put into this hard calcium carbonate structure. And we've already talked about how the reverse of this is also true. If you take this calcium molecule here and hit it with some kind of acid, the process can reverse and dissolve the calcium into the water and release carbon dioxide in the process. So that is also not only part of the calcium cycle, but it's also part of the carbon cycle. So carbon is also moving around in these reactions as well. We saw this whenever I put the vinegar or hydrochloric acid on the limestone and we saw all the bubbles. Those bubbles were carbon dioxide. So that was carbon being released from the rock to the atmosphere. A process that we haven't talked about with limestone is that actually limestone is a crucial ingredient to make something called lime, which is what we make concrete out of. And to make limestone into lime or concrete, we have to cook it, we have to heat it up, and it basically does a similar process as hitting it with acid. Basically, it will release the carbon dioxide and leave a calcium oxide molecule behind. But what this process does, again, is take carbon out of the rock and put it into the air. All right, so now comes kind of the challenging part, is sort of seeing those patterns emerge and organizing it in some kind of graphic that illustrates the connections between all these different processes. So for the most part, this diagram here covers everything that we were just talking about and adds a few other things to it. But let's just kind of discuss it real quick. Again, this kind of works as a circle, so it doesn't really matter where you start, but we can track the carbon as it moves around different things. The first process we talked about today was photosynthesis, and that is the process where CO2 in the air, so carbon in the air, is absorbed by plants and to make sugar. All right. Of course, plants also will burn this sugar later in life for energy, or animals will sometimes eat the plant and get the sugar from the plant. That's getting into food chain stuff, but the idea is that basically, though, that is the keyword respiration. Decomposition is generally the word that's used for kind of breaking down fresh dead stuff. So if a bacteria or a fungus is breaking down some leaf on the forest floor, it's technically not eating the tree, but it is breaking down that carbon that was once part of the tree. And so we see carbon can move from the atmosphere into plants, and then from there, through respiration, it can move back into the atmosphere. There's kind of a natural cycle to these two things. Of course, also we've learned about acid rain and how when it rains, some of this carbon dioxide in the air will mix with the water and produce carbonic acid, and that can fall into the water, and that's how carbon can get into the water and dissolve into the water. And then I also mentioned how these shellfish can take this carbon and make it into shells, and they can die and become limestone. Great. So that's all on this chart as well. The thing that we didn't mention is that some of this tree material here, as it's dying and getting buried deeper and deeper into the earth, not all of it is returned immediately to the atmosphere through decomposition and respiration. Some of it sinks further and further and becomes coal, oil, and gas. And then here we are digging it up and burning it. They call it oxidation. I use the word combustion. And that can, once again, you take this carbon that is underground and you're burning it, and that puts it back into the air as CO2. And so basically what we can see is that there's just all these interconnected systems in the world, and carbon is moving through all of these systems. The carbon that's in a tree came from photosynthesis from the air. The carbon in you came from you eating stuff and is going to be released back into the air by you as you're breathing and burning energy. And pretty much every carbon atom in the world can be traced down to being in one of these places and moving from one of these places to another. And this gets to the point in the lecture where, I'm sure I'm not the only one that kind of feels this way sometimes in education. It's like, okay, great, we can put all this together. Who cares about any of this stuff? Like, why do we need to know how carbon atoms are moving in the world? Well, it is important. So before humans got on planet Earth, we could think of there being a bit of a balance between carbon in the biosphere and carbon in the atmosphere. So for example, any carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be moved over to these plants. Then through various consumption processes and food webs and things, the carbon can work its way to animals and fungus and bacteria and all kinds of other things. And generally they're going to break this carbon down, these sugars down, and release CO2 back to the atmosphere, and it makes a nice little cycle here. For the most part, over the course of Earth's history, these things are at a relative balance. There are times where things can get out of balance a bit, and that can cause changes, but for the most part, these things are kind of in harmony in nature. Then we bring humans into it, and humans, through our creation of concrete and our burning of fossil fuels that we're digging up out of the ground like crazy, we are adding more carbon to the atmosphere for which there is really no counterbalance. It's not like all of a sudden, as we put more carbon in the atmosphere, there's going to be more coal and oil and gas made by the earth deep underground. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the world. If we look over the last million or so years, yes, we had some fluctuating carbon levels over here over this period of time. If you can see the graph here, down at the bottom, this is 800,000 years ago, and here's present day. So for this, almost 800,000 year time period, yeah, carbon fluctuated a bit here and there. Went from, it looks like about 300 is the high, and the low point is maybe here at 175. If we look at where it is today, the atmospheric carbon, how much carbon is in the atmosphere, and again, only about 300 years ago did we start burning oil and gas and coal like crazy. What we see is that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has gone basically to the moon. It's just exploded out of control to levels that we haven't seen in millions and millions of years. That's because humans are knocking the Earth out of this natural carbon balance. You might be saying, okay, whatever, who cares? There's more carbon in the atmosphere. What does that have to do with anything? Well, unfortunately, here's another graph showing it year by year since 1960 to 2020. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere is just going up and up and up each year. And the unfortunate thing about that is that atmospheric carbon, things like carbon dioxide and some other molecules of carbon that happen to be in the atmosphere, they trap heat from the sun over time. And the more carbon that's in the atmosphere, the more heat that is being trapped, and the hotter things get. And that's our friend, or not so friend. And that is what the basis of global warming is. This graph here shows the average temperature in the United States over the last 60 years. And you can see that for a good chunk of the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, you know, the average temp was here around 51 and a half, maybe 52. In that range, that's where most of the values are. And if you notice, and in the last, 25 years, it seems like we're kind of on this general upward trajectory, where the average temperature now is in the 52s or the 53s even. And this is worse in some places than others, but yes, it is impossible to deny the fact that things are getting hotter in the world, and it has to do with the carbon cycle and this carbon balance, and how there is no counterbalance to the amount of carbon that we are putting in the atmosphere through our practices. All right, so that covers carbon, the main ways that carbon atoms are moving around in the world, and that together makes the carbon cycle, and then why we care about it, which is concepts like global warming.
Attention please, there has been a report of an emergency. Proceed calmly to the nearest exit and leave the building immediately. Do not use the elevators. Use stairwells where necessary. All handicapped occupants shall use the building evacuation plan.
What is going on? Okay.